Ossification is the laying down of new bone. So this is how new bone is formed in your body through the process of ossification. So keeping in mind that the prefix osseo is referring to bone, then we're talking about new bone being formed, ossification, also known as osteogenesis. So the creation of new bone. Okay. This laying down of new bone will occur since the embryo is being formed in the womb and all the way to the end of adolescence, which means to the end of puberty. Once puberty has ended, there is no new bone being laid down. There is constantly reformation of the actual bone, so that current bone that you have will continue to be broken down and rebuilt, but there will be no laying down of new bone. So your ossification ends once puberty has ended. And there are two distinct ways in which new bone is laid down or in which ossification occurs. One is called intramembranous ossification, and the other one is called endochondral ossification. And so we're going to look briefly at both of these, but one of these is one I want you to know the most, okay? But it is important that you are able to distinguish between intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. So for starters, your intramembranous ossification, this one is going to occur mostly in your flat bones. So remembering that flat bones and long bones have a very different structure. Long bones have the epiphysis, right? Spongy, and then compact in the middle. Your flat bones are going to look more like a sandwich with compact, and spongy in the middle. So when new bone is going to be made, it's going to be made differently than the way long bone will be made. And this is because of that different ratio and opposite way of having the compact, spongy, compact versus spongy, compact, spongy. Okay. So this one starts with connective tissue membrane. And basically what happens is that you're going to have a connective tissue membrane growing first, and then the laying down of the bone occurring from that. Okay, so that middle layer, that spongy bone, is going to form first, and then you grow the edges of the bone. So you start by making the spongy bone in the middle, and then you grow those outer parts or those ends of that sandwich. I'm not going to go into much detail about the steps of intramembranous ossification. I want to focus more on the steps of endochondral ossification. But I do want you to understand that long bone and flat bone will be made differently. Flat bones are made by intramembranous ossification using a connective tissue membrane, hence the word membranous, and intra because that membrane starts to form inside of that spongy bone. Endochondral ossification is what is made in long bones. It's how long bones are developed. Chondral referring to cartilage. So instead of using your connective tissue membrane like you did in your intramembranous ossification, you're instead going to use what is called a cartilage model. Most of the bones of the skeleton are going to be made through endochondral ossification. And so what happens is first you have a cartilage being laid down in a pattern called a bone collar. And then from there, you're going to have internal cartilage calcify. The chondrocytes start to die, right? The cartilage starts to die. Instead, it gets replaced with spongy bone. The medullary cavity is created, so that empty space that can be filled with the blood vessels and the nerves. Then the epiphysis, those ends will be filled with spongy bone. And then finally, that any remaining cartilage will be calcified, except where you're going to have those epiphyseal lines that we've talked about, which is also known as the epiphyseal plate. And that is where the bone will continue to lengthen And of course, our articular cartilage, which is going to be covering the ends of the epiphysis. Okay, so this is kind of what it looks like when you have growth along bones. So first you're going to start with what is called a bone collar, and you can see this here. Okay, so the bone collar, you start having new cartilage being created. And that's what's called a bone cartilage. New cartilage cells are being laid down. And then those cartilage cells will start to die and be replaced with the bone cells of spongy bone first. And then as those cells are replaced with your spongy bone, they will then start to form an empty space, which is going to be your medullary cavity. And you can see your medullary cavity being formed here. And then in that medullary cavity, you can have the blood vessels and the nerves run through it. It starts to form its compact bone all around it. And towards the end, it stays with spongy bone in the epiphysis. And all areas are going to calcify into that spongy bone except where you have your epiphyseal plate. So here where your epiphyseal plate is, and here where you have your articular cartilage will be the only places left with actual cartilage cells. Everything else will be ossified, replaced with bone cells. So what you have to understand here is that we're always going to start with the laying down of cartilage first. So you have cartilage being laid down first, hyaline cartilage specifically. Then that cartilage starts to get ossified, starts to become bone cells. You start to form that central canal in your secondary ossification center. And then you start to continue to form all of that ossified into your spongy and compact bone, except where you're going to have the epiphyseal lines and the articular cartilage. Okay, please have an idea of the fact that one type of bone is going to develop using a cartilage model. The other type of bone is going to develop using a intramembranous ossification, so using that membrane model. They're going to have two different ways of developing, but in both cases, it is how bones develop. So this is, remember, the forming of new bone. This is going to be different from how bone grows. So one thing is the laying down of bone, or the making of new bone. The other is going to be bone growth. And bone growth is once you have the bones made, now you actually have to lengthen and widen those bones in size. So you have to make them bigger in size. And this widening and lengthening of bones are called appositional growth for the widening of bones, interstitial growth for the lengthening of bones. Okay. Appositional growth is the way those bones are going to develop widthwise. So if you think about your femur, which is the longest bone in the human body, it's your thigh bone. That's a very, very thick, long bone. So it's still longer than it is thick, but it's still going to be a quite thick bone because it needs to withstand a lot of tension. It needs to be a very strong bone. So it needs to grow a certain diameter, a certain width. And that is appositional growth. Your interstitial growth is going to occur in that person until they finish puberty. They're going to keep increasing the length of that bone. And so, as you already know, by the time you've formed the new bone, the only places that are left with cartilage are going to be the ends of the epiphysis that are covered in articular cartilage and this epiphyseal plate here, which is cartilage. So if bone is going to lengthen, if it's going to keep growing, it is going to need to lay down new cartilage on top of the already existing cartilage of the epiphyseal plate. So it'll increase the size of that epiphyseal plate. So let's look at how that happens. And there's a really great video here for you to watch on this. I've placed also some videos on Blackboard for you under your folders. So I highly suggest watching as many videos as you need to understand well your interstitial growth. You can expect to have to explain interstitial growth and the key steps involved in interstitial growth for your exams. So I do want you to know interstitial growth. It's membranous ossification and chondral ossification will be asked more in terms of like multiple choice questions and just getting out if you understand the main difference between the two and which types of bones tend to do it. Bone widening, I just want you to know that it's called appositional growth. But for bone lengthening, I want you to actually be able to explain the steps involved in in lengthening your existing long bones. So in that interstitial growth, I do want you to understand this well. Okay. And it's always going to occur from the epiphyseal plate distally. So away from the epiphyseal plate towards the diaphysis. That's how it's going to occur. So in this image that you're looking at here, this is a long bone. This is your diaphysis, because remember your diaphysis is going to be the majority of the bone. This is your epiphysis up here. This here is your only zone of cartilage. So you do have cartilage here, but this cartilage is called articular cartilage. It's a specialized type of hyaline cartilage that is for the sole purpose of avoiding abrasion between the articulating of two bones. So that one is not going to be used for your growth. What you do use for your growth is going to be this one here. So remembering that this here, which is found in the spongy bone of both epiphyses, so on both sides of the long bone, you are going to have this guy here. Okay. And that's known as your growth plate or growth lines. And you can see that here. Okay. And in that growth plate is where you're going to have the lengthening of bone start to occur. And it's going to go downwise. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to lay down new cartilage cells. And as they go lying down, they're going to go in this direction, downwards. So they always grow distally. Okay. So they're going to go away from the epiphysis towards the diaphysis. Okay. So here you can see this is showing you what we're doing here is we're taking this piece here and we're highlighting it. So this whole thing here is this one little bit here. Let me show you that again. What we're doing is we're taking this piece here and we're showing it you in all of this. Okay. So you can see here, this is epiphysis made of spongy bone. Here's where you have the cartilage cells in that growth plate, and they're called the resting zone. When you're going to lengthen the bone, you're going to make new cartilage cells, and those cartilage cells are going to start to grow, and that is called your proliferating zone as they start to grow, and they start to head towards the diaphysis. Okay, away from the epiphysis towards the diaphysis always. And as they continue to multiply and grow, they're going to start to die, which is your degenerating zone. And as they die, they will be replaced by bone ossification. Remember, ossification is laying down a bone. So once those cartilage cells die, you now lay down new bone. So your bones grow towards your diaphysis always. Here, this video that I mentioned before does really great job explaining this, and this is laying out those steps that I just talked about. So first, your chondrocytes replicate and enlarge in that proliferating zone. The cartilage plates grow, increasing the bone length, and they grow towards the diaphysis. The bone becomes replaced with cartilage as the cartilage dies, and then the epiphyseal plate will always remain the same size because those new cartilage cells become calcified, so they become bone, always leaving that part of this resting zone the same. If you have questions, feel free to let me know. You can go to tutoring. You can also watch these videos over and over and over again. All right. The next parts we're going to talk about, and I know this can be pretty lengthy, but there's a lot here in skeletal. We're almost done. So the next video will talk about bone growth, and we're going to look about how hormones regulate your bone growth, and then what can happen to bones with age. We will also talk briefly about the breakage of bones because you'll mostly be covering that in one of your assignments.